Welcome back to another special episode of the Mathematicians Podcast in our subseries called The Injectives, where I get to talk one-to-one with someone far more qualified than myself. Today, I am delighted to have as my guest on the show one of my personal role models, Dr. Thomas Daffern. Dr. Daffern is the director of the International Institute of Peace Studies and Global Philosophy. He is a published author with an impressive library of titles, and he is an educator of religion and philosophy. But for me personally, he was my old philosophy teacher. In case you are unaware, I have an A-level in philosophy, and I can thank Dr. Daffern for my grade E. Although, in fairness to him, I was only 14 at the time, and this wasn't one of my school's official lessons, just the once-a-week after-school club. Honestly, I don't know how he managed to convince the exams officer to let us sit the paper. Hello, Dr. Daffern, welcome to the show.
Well, greetings. Hello, Ben. Yes, it's nice to see you again. And to hear you're now working as a maths teacher, it's brilliant.
Yes.
And I enjoyed teaching at Poole, and managing to persuade the exams officer wasn't that difficult. It just, in the staff room, we just had words and it was done.
If only life was that simple these days. So the main reason why Dr. Daffern has been invited today is his expertise in the intersection of mathematics and religion. Would you like to tell the listeners a little about this new discipline that you're working on?
Yes. Well, about a few years ago now, just before the lockdown, I actioned a project that I'd always had dear to my heart, which when you were at Poole Grammar, I used to run a few topics past the students about really complex mathematical puzzles that come up to do with religions. And the questions like, how many religious believers there are in different faiths, how we could arrive at that scientifically, demographically, and then how many have there been in the whole totality of history. Like there aren't that many Zoroastrians on the planet right now, a few 100,000, but there have been lots of millions in the past when the Persian Empire was at its height for 800 years. So those are mathematical questions. And then there's questions like how many gods there are, which religions compute how many gods, and how would we know how many gods there are? And so I thought, no, there's something interesting here. And I looked around, and nobody had ever researched this. So I put together mentally two Venn diagrams, two circles. One is called the sum totality of all religious studies, which is a hugely complex field in itself. And the other circle is the entire field of all mathematical sciences, which, as you know, is incredibly complex. And there's whole branches, geometry, algebra, the whole works. And now if you overlap these two circles, you get a middle bit. And that's what I call religious mathematics. And it's to do with computing and enumerating the complexity of some of those religious questions. And it's also to do with looking at some of the mathematical puzzles through a more metaphysical lens. So it's absolutely fascinating. And then I wrote 3 books about this in a kind of, it took about a year. But once I get a project, I stick at it. And I'm still got the 4th volume. I haven't had time to finish it yet, but I've got the chapters worked out, and I'm determined to finish it. So it's a fascinating field. And I did discover a few rarefied thinkers scattered around. There's a Spanish Jesuit who's written a book on metaphysics and mathematics and religion, for instance, and a few others, But it's not well known as a field.
I like the way you describe a lot of the topics in the contents page of your books, where they can be broadly distinguished into the enumeration of religion, but also the moralizing and religiousizing of the mathematics as well. So it's in a sense both the mathematics of religion and the religion of mathematics.
Correct. Yeah.
A lot of people, looking at the Venn diagram, a lot of people might be skeptical and say that the intersection is the empty set. But I'm hoping that in today's episode, you're going to be able to convince us that there is a value in studying the religious mathematics. So let's begin. the story that I've been telling so far of the maths history, it's been intertwined with astronomy, with logic, with philosophy, with metaphysics, and indeed with religion. Most of the mathematicians that we deal with also had something to say about religion as well. Could I invite you to comment on whether this overlap between mathematical insight and religious ascription is a purely historic trend or something that we still see correlated into the present day? Do you think the two perhaps are inextricably linked?
Well, they're both intellectual activities, aren't they? And human beings have minds. We're symbolic making creatures, as Ernst Cassirer, the great philosopher, said. It's what demarcates us as from other animals. And maths is a symbolic world which our minds have created in different cultural contexts. So Chinese mathematics is different to Babylonian mathematics, Egyptian, ancient Greek, medieval European, Celtic, and so on. And normally, where you have this mathematical thing going on, and by the way, how old is it? Well, we know that our ancestors here in Europe were making notches on bones to mark the moon's phases from about 40,000 BC onwards. So we have evidence of mathematical thinking going on to do with the precession of the moon and the heavens for at least the last 45,000 years. And they found similar things in Africa, even older. The oldest actual sign of kind of religious archaeology dates back to 70,000 BC in South Africa. They found a cave with evidence of religious worship going on. And there are carved stones they found in South Africa which have geometric shapes. So our ancestors were thinking mathematically, and they were also thinking religiously. And I think if you went back to visit ancient China or Greece or Rome or Persia or any or the Druid world, any great civilization would say yes, they're all part of the same thing: human cognition, reflection, musing, if you want. They're just dealing with different aspects of the one universal forest of the unknown.
Do you think the same thing is true in the modern day, though? So, for instance, most philosophers that I speak to have something to say about logic and arguably would consider themselves to be in a slightly more pure field of mathematics than mathematicians. And a lot of mathematicians that I speak to definitely have something to say about religion, although more often than not, it's in the atheist version of religion. Do you think there is still a intrinsic link between the two in the modern day?
Yes, I think there is. I mean, I've met different mathematicians and philosophers and religious thinkers, and they often have something to say about these things. I think one of the problems with academia, certainly in Britain, America, other parts of the world, is that it divides people up into different categories and different fields of specialization, I think, too early. It's a problem even with the A-level structure of secondary schools and so on. I'm quite old-fashioned as a philosopher. I think that knowledge is all an interconnected continuum, like an ocean, as Newton said, and that whereas we're forced to specialize, and even to subspecialize within the field. So if you do decide you want to become a mathematician, you end up just studying one field of that and doing a PhD of hyper specialization on it. And the same with philosophy. It's become a very hyper specialized game in academia, as Wittgenstein said. It's a language game. Well, I want us all to step back from that and look at the bigger picture. As a philosopher, I'm a historian and a bigger picture kind of guy, and I can see lots of exciting things when you do step back and look at the correlations between all these subdivisions of knowledge. You realize, gosh, these things are really interconnected. And some of the most intelligent, most creative mathematicians, I mean, Descartes, Newton, whatever, have realized that. They've been bigger picture kind of guys. And they're still around. There are still some. We have some in France here. There's a few in Britain. Those are the guys to watch because they're going to bring forth new ways of thinking about philosophy and maths.
Okay, all right. It's funny that you say we've become hyper specialized. That rings true. I work on a few other communication projects with mathematicians, and they'll always introduce themselves as a set theorist or as a group theorist, and rarely just use the word mathematician.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
I'm interested in you talking about our historical roots for mathematics and for religion going back to the tens of thousands. As listeners to the podcast will know, our mathematical thread starts in Egypt in 1700 BCE, and that's because we focus on the mathematicians whose name that we know. So we start with Ames from ancient Egypt. We then jump about 1,000 years to Asia Minor, and then we've been dancing around the various Greek colonies for about 300 years. And by the time this episode comes out, I think we will have just finished Hero of Alexandria, who is our first mathematician into the Common Era. So would you be able to preface this conversation on mathematics and religion by giving us a quick summary of the state of religion up to this time? So before the birth of Christ, what's going on with religion? What does it mean to be religious? Does the trend of confrontational religions that we see nowadays, was that true back then as well, with different religions being constantly at war with each other? Or was there more of a universal pantheon where all gods are welcome?
Well, those are brilliant questions and really complex. But if you do what I've done and go back to the ancient history of religions, I got an ancient history A level when I was young, and I loved it because it puts everything in a much bigger perspective of time. And I'm fascinated by Sumerian religion and Mesopotamian religion, as well as ancient Egyptian. In those first cradles of civilization where urbanization first developed, you got the first urban structures, cities, and they all had temples at the heart. The temple was a sacred place where the entire community would go and they would have festivals, celebrations, they'd have quiet places for prayers, they'd have rituals, and they were staffed by specialists. And we're talking from about 3000 BC onwards. And those guys invented writing. So we owe literacy to the religious priests and priestesses in the temples. And they were also developing mathematics. So in Babylon and Sumeria, they were developing astronomy. They were gazing up at the heavens and marking the procession of all the planets and constellations, giving them names and mapping them for the first time, in history. I mean, probably that had happened in places like Silbury Hill in Wiltshire, when Druids had been doing the same, but we don't have any written records. In Sumeria, we have written records, and Babylon, which British archaeologists went up and found in Iraq, and dug up, and French as well. So there's always been a huge overlap between the intellectual activities in the temples, the priests and priestesses. I mean, in ancient Egypt, it was the same. They had a goddess in charge of mathematics, Seshat. And so the priests of Seshat would be given special instruction in doing geometry and mathematics and so on. But it was all regarded as a sacred work. What we should realize is that knowledge itself was seen as sacred. It comes from the gods, and Plato puts this into his dialogues, into the laws, which I'm listening to as a talking book at the moment. The Laws, I recommend. I mean, in his old age, he wrote this book. Now, he was trained partly in Egypt. Plato loved mathematics. So he's an example of a thinker that's steeped in religion and mathematics. But for him, and for all these priesthoods, the key question is about morality. If a state loses all sight of morality and ethics, and loses all piety and reverence, and becomes puffed up with its own hubris or arrogance, that state is going to fall. So whether you're studying religion or ritual or ceremony or healing, which was another thing developed in these temples, medicine, you had to do it in such a way that you're doing it for the benefit of the whole, the community. It's not about ego. It's not about, I'm the best mathematician. It's, no, I'm a servant of the gods, sharing what I can of my knowledge with my colleagues. And we know this is true from the texts we've discovered, both in Egypt and Mesopotamia. And the Greeks picked up on all that. So you're wise to have focused on the Greeks. Well done, because they were the front line of Europe's Asia component. Because in Asia Minor, these towns like Miletus and Ephesus that gave birth to philosophy, they were where they had visiting Oriental thinkers coming in from the Persian Empire, bringing these amazing ideas from Babylon, from Mesopotamia. And we know that Pythagoras spent time studying in Mesopotamia and Phoenicia. So it was a very exciting time to be alive because of the travels, the interfertilization of cultures and civilizations. Yeah, and I'm happy it's happening now. This is an exciting time to be alive, as long as we can not blow each other up with nuclear war. And, we have to crack the mathematics of peace, which is what I've been working on recently.
But it sounds like what you're saying is that it's only really the last tiny fraction of history, the last 1500 years, say, where religion has been confrontational. Before that, it sounds like there weren't the same harsh lines between different religions of different cultures, and people could move more fluidly. Is that right?
Well, I think there's something you ought to read. There's a book called The Alphabet versus the Goddess by Leonard Schlein, who argues a thesis I also put forward, which is that the key thing that happened in religious history was the invention of the alphabet. Alphabetization, although it was a great leap forward, and it was much simpler than complex cuneiform and hieroglyphs, which hitherto you'd had to learn to master to be a priest or priestess in either Egypt or Sumeria. Now you could just learn 26 letters or so and call yourself a learned person. And then the trouble was that then, before long, people started writing down their sacred stories in an alphabetical book and then saying, this is the only truth. This is the best book, the sole truth. And our book is better than your book. So we've been having alphabet wars, and the alphabet was invented in about 1700 BC, precisely in the region, the Levant, where the Bible came from. And the Bible is named after Byblos, the town in Phoenicia, near where the alphabet was invented. So that's the epicenter of this. In a sense, it was a catastrophe, because hitherto savants had known that all knowledge is interconnected, and it doesn't matter if you're visiting Sumeria or Egypt or China, because there was congress across to China. You were accepted as a wise person, and you would go and sit in the temple and learn. But after this, it became, which book do you follow? And if you gave the wrong answer, you'd get your head chopped off. That is barbarism. And sadly,
can you give an idea of when that started?
Well, as I say, it started with the invention of the alphabet in about 1700 BC. And then we have the first sort of alphabetized religions develop. I mean, the Greeks got the alphabet fairly early from the Phoenicians.
So what I mean is, could you give an idea of when it started that one nation would chop off the heads of a neighboring nation over religion?
Well, I mean, I think if we want to start talking about dates, we might want to say the Trojan War is quite an important date, 1200 BC. I was sitting on the mound of Troy a couple of years back thinking, gosh, this is a catastrophe here. That's when Asia and Europe decided they were enemies and hated each other, which I think is ridiculous. You could also talk about the invention of the Hebrew sacred books in the temple in Jerusalem about 1000 BC. And I think what happened in the Hebrew religion was this notion that our God is the only God, exclusive, monotheistic. And this was an offshoot of Mosaic influence. Moses probably lived about 1500 BC and led an escapee movement coming out of Egypt, where he learned advanced Egyptian thinking and monotheism. But because he was leading a people that he wanted to give his own imprimatur, God's chosen people, the book that they crafted became exclusivist. And if you actually read, there are whole passages in what we now call the Old Testament or the Tanakh that are pretty bloodthirsty, and that's that do sanction the mass murder of the person that reads or studies the wrong book or follows the wrong God.
The reason I
and then,
ask,
yeah,
the reason I ask is this: this time you're describing predates most of the mathematicians that we're talking about on the show. But we see a lot of philosophers who are moving around, and generally they all either end up in Athens or a little bit later on ending up in Alexandria. So would their religions from their hometowns have been a barrier? Or perhaps are we only seeing the people that come through that have the correct religion as a sort of natural filter?
Well, I mean, it's a complex story, but by and large, I've just read a biography of Herod the Great, which is a fascinating figure. He was friendly to the Hellenistic world, and he sponsored temples being built to pagan gods in Delos, the sacred island of Apollo. He spent time in Rome. He was a friend of Augustus, and he met Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And, so he was somebody who was both Jewish, followed the monotheistic creed, rebuilt the Second Temple, but also was open to paganism and Hellenism. Not all, and he wasn't, by the way, himself ethnically Jewish. He was what's called an Edomite or an Idumean. But the fault line was really between the fanatics who said, no, all Hellenism is evil, and who, which led to the Roman-Jewish War, which is written about by Josephus. And this, from the scholarly perspective I'm coming from, was a catastrophe. And as you rightly say, a lot of very famous later mathematicians were Jewish. And in the European context, that ecumenism, is a hard-won battle. That's what we believe in France, in our republic, that if you're a clever person, it doesn't matter whether you're Jewish or Arabic or Moroccan or British, you should be esteemed.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. I think you've also preempted one of my later questions on Jewish mathematicians, but we'll explore that in more detail. One character of note is Thales, who we met in episode 2. And I said at the time that he was novel for seeking rational explanations for natural events rather than seeking a mystical explanation. Do you think it's fair to categorize the world of knowledge into the mystic and demonstrative? So things that might be known versus things that must be believed. And is that a natural fault line between mathematics and religion, or is it not that simple?
Before we do that, I just want to say a little thing about the etymology of mathematics, because this is important.
Mathematics. I was going to ask you that question to you at the end. I just decided to.
Oh, okay. Well, let me just before I answer the other one, let me just jump into that, because
okay.
Mathematics itself comes from a root in Greek meaning learning. A mathematikos was a learned person, and it comes from a root meaning knowledge. And it's used in the New Testament. For instance, when Jesus talks about his disciples, they are mathetes. So effectively, the disciples of Christ were mathematicians, because the word mathematician meant a learned person. They were disciples, learning a discipline. And so is there a fault line between mathematical approaches to knowledge or mystical? I think probably not. I think Jesus, when he was holding forth and teaching, he was drawing on both reason, empirical knowledge. That's why he's using parables. He's saying, hey, it's like when something real happens in the field. To get across really complex ideas, he would use empirical, factual stuff. But also, he was dealing with very complex mystical things. The kingdom of God is within us all, etc., etc. And I think he's drawing on a long line of ancient thinkers both in Judaism, because there was, just to go back a bit, there was a rival school of thought in Judaism which wasn't in support of the temple monopoly of knowledge. The temple wanted to say, we control all knowledge. If to be Jewish, you have to come here and give us a tax and do our rituals. The Samaritans didn't agree with that. They said, no, Jerusalem isn't the sacred city founded by Moses. They're all heretics. And Jesus was on what's called the Essene wing of Christianity and was from the Enochian branch of esoteric Judaism, which was much more cosmic, much more. I mean, the books of Enoch are fantastically full of complex mathematics about cosmology. We know they were being studied in the time of Jesus because they found scraps of them in the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. And Jesus is familiar with the book of Enoch. A lot of his terminology comes from that. And so there was this rival school of thought to the temple cult in Jerusalem. So I think what you got in let's call it the politics of knowledge, is this centralizing tendency. You know, you have to follow our way, our system, our way of codifying what is acceptable knowledge, versus the more decentralized. And I think the mystic is in that decentralized version that wants to think outside the box, wants to access reality without having to go through officialdom. So you've got a tension going in both the sciences and in the spiritual sciences. What was the role of Thales and the Greeks? Well, that's a really important point, because when you study philosophy, you start with them, the pre-Socratics, as they're called, and there's a bunch of fascinating ones, Heraclitus and Thales and Anaximander, and and Parmenides, they all had this idea that we're going to try and find truth. We're going to look for the absolute source of everything. They called it the arche. And they want to prove it. So they do turn to mathematics and they help develop mathematics. Pythagoras is one of these pre-Socratics. I think it would be oversimplification to say that they were only interested in the demonstrable. I think what they were trying to do was to map the mystical, but in a demonstrable way. And so, it's a more complicated cross-fertilization between empirical knowledge and mystical knowledge than your question would imply, I think. Yeah.
Well, to be honest, I was somewhat goading you into the "it's not that simple" answer, and you did not disappoint. In the later Renaissance, we see a conflict between mathematics and religion, so Galileo being the famous example. But was this conflict always there? Or a better question might be, how were the early scientists treated? Do we have martyrs to learning in the pre-Christian world?
I think in the pre-Christian world, no, I think scientists were honored and they emerged out of that pre-Christian, let's call it pagan world, which Alexandria represented, and so did Miletus and Athens. These were all very tolerant societies in which, because of their polytheism, they had many gods and goddesses, and so they had this inbuilt idea that you could worship, whichever suited you, and you wouldn't be persecuted. So there was little religious persecution going on. I mean, they fought, they had dreadful fights between Athens and Sparta, etc., and between Rome and their neighboring cities. And human beings do have this aggression in us, sadly, and this ability to make conflicts. But I think science was something different. I mean, there's the famous story of Archimedes, one of the greatest mathematicians, being killed by a Roman soldier. And he wasn't killed because he was a mathematician. He was killed because he was in the way and the Roman soldier was just doing this job when they captured Syracuse. Tragedy. But so I think what happened there was something weird happened when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. It brought in a kind of intolerance, paradoxically. And there were then martyrs in Alexandria. So Hypatia, the famous one, the woman mathematician, pagan, was then killed by a bunch of demented monks. There's a very good film about that with Rachel Weisz. And this idea that it goes back to this idea of there's only one truth and we have a monopoly of truth. Now, no self-respecting pagan would have ever thought like that. You may have Dionysus's truth, you may have Athena's truth, or Isis's truth, or Hermes, or whatever. We'll live in tolerance with each other. spent years trying to work out where that intolerance came from. I think partly it came from the Zoroastrian idea, this war between good and evil, absolute good versus absolute evil. And that was then picked up and was at the root of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic intolerance, because they got the idea of the devil from the Zoroastrians, and then they could justify attacking you and killing you because you're working for the devil. Now we're seeing this even happening in Ukraine when Putin invades Ukraine, says he's attacking Satanists. That's like, a revamp. Or when Netanyahu attacks Gaza and said he's attacking devil worshippers, So that idea of the devil is very dangerous and toxic. Were scientists treated as diabolic? Yes, they were to some extent. There's the famous example of Dr. John Dee, who coined the phrase the British Empire, one of my heroes, who the mob suspected of being a black magician. And when he came to Europe on a tour, they burnt his library in Mortlake. And in his circle was algebra developed in Tudor Britain. He was an astrologer who fixed the date of Queen Elizabeth I's coronation, by the way. And we should say that there was a close relationship between astrology, astronomy, and mathematics at that time. So anyone doing advanced maths was regarded with suspicion by the mob, and they could be martyred. Even up to the late 18th century, Joseph Priestley, the founder of the discoverer of oxygen, great scientist, he had his library destroyed by the mob because they suspected him of being a dangerous Republican and a free thinker. So knowledge is always dangerous, really, to the ignoranti, as I call them.
So you've preempted my original follow-up questions. I'm going to change my follow-up slightly and talk about Pythagoras, who his episode title is The Mathematician, who he created the cult of mysticism around him. Would his own personal religion of Pythagoreanism have been accepted into the greater pantheon, or do you think someone like him stood out too far and would have caused conflict with the people around him?
Gosh, I love Pythagoras. He was a fantastic chap, and he was half Phoenician. His father was Phoenician, his mother was Greek. So he stood for this sort of multicultural fusion of Semitic and Indo-European culture. He spent time studying in Egypt, in Babylon, in Phoenicia, in Delphi, in Greece. And he put together a sort of integrative worldview. He was like the Ken Wilber of the 6th century BC, if you want. Those that were intelligent respected and loved him and knew what he was doing. Of course, there was always the mob. And in the end, it was a mob that got Pythagoras. I don't know if you know the story, but he was martyred because there was one chap called Milo who wasn't really an intellectual, didn't know what was going on. But he saw, well, this is a good thing. I want to join Pythagoras's academy. But Pythagoras said, no, you're not ready. You're not suitable. You're not an ideal candidate. You don't have self-discipline. So he refused to let him in. So Milo got a mob together, which stormed the premises, torched it, and burned Pythagoras to death. So, there's a martyr for mathematics and science and philosophy, because they divinized number. You remember the 10 points. The tetractys, as it's called, was the root of Pythagorean number mysticism. And a later Neo-Pythagorean called Iamblichus wrote a book called The Theology of Arithmetic, which has come down. We have it in Greek, it's been translated, about how these numbers are effectively the gods. Because for Pythagoras, they're the cause, they're the arche, the source of everything is number. But with that came a kind of, I like your word, a myth. What did he say? A mathematician?
The mathematician.
Yeah, that's a brilliant word. Yeah.
The story I tell of his death is that the mob were chasing him. So he ran out of his house and through the fields. But he came across a bean field, and obviously he couldn't step on the beans because they contain the souls of the departed. So he ran around the right-angled corner of the field, but the mob just went along the hypotenuse and overtook him.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that variant. I wasn't
Well, I think that's more of a Pythagoras' theorem joke, but apocryphal one hopes.
Well, it's a
Um,
sad story anyway, and this is the danger of. I've coined a phrase, Sophiaphobia, which is what the mob feels, which is the fear or hatred of wisdom.
oh yeah,
I just finished a commentary on the Gospel of Matthew and Mark, where Sophiaphobia explains the hatred of Jesus, who was just an advanced Pythagorean teacher of wisdom. Why did the mob hate him so much? Because of Sophiaphobia. They repress wisdom because it's a threat to structures, systems based on power and so on. So as an explanatory model, these are key concepts, I think, if you're going to study the history of ideas and how they interact politically over time. But yes, there have been many martyrs to Sophiaphobia, sadly.
I think the flip side of the coin of Sophiaphobia would be idiolatry, the idolatry of being an idiot.
How would you spell that word?
Idiolatry,
Yeah.
badly. I don't know. I'm just thinking on my feet.
Okay, well, no, have a think about it and send me a potential spelling. But you mean the idolatry of ideas?
Idolatry of idiocy,
Ah, okay. Well,
as opposed to the phobia of wisdom.
yes. Okay. No, I've published a dictionary of new words because I'm always coining new words. Sophiaphobia is in that dictionary, and it's an interesting field because I was inspired by Sir Francis Bacon, who was at the root of that Tudor Renaissance of thought, who coined a lot of new words for us, and who tried to combine empiricism with science and mathematics and so on. So I think you have to coin new words to describe new ideas, new thoughts.
I was very much intending to edit out my attempt at some bad puns, but then you went and said something interesting afterwards, so I think I might need to leave it in. Back to the wider context. So I have been hinting to listeners that our story of mathematics is very soon going to be leaving Greece. And in fact, last week on the episode, we had our very first, arguably Roman mathematician of Hero of Alexandria. And we speed through Roman mathematics very quickly because there's not very much to talk about into the Islamic Golden Age. However, Islam doesn't really get started until about the 7th century or so. So could you tell me what was going on in the Arabic world pre-Islam, both in terms of the organized religion or indeed the wider religious context or indeed the mathematical context? So was there much of a development in maths and science and philosophy pre-Golden Age?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I did finish a long commentary on the Quran a few years back, which I'm about to publish. It's a talking book at the moment, and I researched the question of Arabic culture and how it interacted with its neighbors. I discovered something very interesting. There were Arabic kingdoms in southern Iraq, which were called the Lakhmid Kingdom, Lakhmid, and their capital was a place called Hira. They had an amalgam of really interesting cultures all swirling around. Gnostic Christians, Nestorian Christians, Zoroastrians coming through from Persia, Manichaeans. Mani was a teacher in about the 2nd century AD, who was a synthesizer. He tried to bring Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Christianity all into a kind of universality. And I speculate in the Quran that that's where Muhammad spent a lot of time, because it was directly on the trade routes between Mecca and the capital of the Persian Empire. It went through Hira. And as a merchant, for 15 years, that was his job. And he would have been sitting in Hira listening to all these fantastic conversations. That's where the Quran came from, was that sort of interfaith swirling aroundness that was going on. Now, what you've got to realize is that the Persian Empire and the Arabic culture that was on its fringes absorbed all the mathematical wisdom of Mesopotamia, of Babylon, and of Sumeria. So the the Persian Empire used Aramaic. It adopted a script, alphabetical script, and it had itself very advanced intellectuals, mathematicians. And the Arabs were absorbing all that. The Arab culture was also connected to, obviously, to parts of Lebanon and Syria. And there were important Arabic fringe cultures on the edge of the Roman Empire. And they were, I mean, Herod the Great was one. Herod was effectively an Idumean. There was a kingdom at Edessa, which was Arabic speaking. So there was a lot of intellectual activity going on in the Arab world, which then fed into Islam. When Muhammad turned up and said, look, everything is one, there's actually only one God. These are all aspects of that one God. And this tremendous miracle happened of the expansion of Islam. I think people were ready for that because they were looking towards unity. And they'd already worked out mathematically that the most important number is one. All number, I mean, this is just a little teaser, but all numbers are a derivative of one. If you don't have unity, mathematics is impossible. I mean, all numbers smaller than one, fractions, decimals, whatever, they're all aspects of one. You need a one to have them. And all numbers bigger than one are multiples of one. So that was the genius of Muhammad to see that. And then mathematics really took off in the Arabic world. Incredibly intelligent people in Baghdad, throughout Persia. I mean, they were advanced thinkers when Europe still didn't have knives and forks. We were living in mud huts, you know. And the Golden Age of Islam, I think your students are going to love it when you get onto that, the invention of algebra and all that stuff. But it was made possible by the earlier Mesopotamian mathematics and also the Greek, because the Arabs absorbed all the Greek currents. They studied Pythagoras, they had Plato, they translated Aristotle, they had Euclid. You know, advanced mathematics survived because of Islam and the Arabic world, based on its earlier reverence for knowledge. There's a famous hadith of Muhammad, seek knowledge even as far as China, because the Arabs went to China as well and absorbed their learning.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that the drive for knowledge, research, and indeed mathematics pre-existed and has really just stayed around ever since the Babylonians were doing early astronomy and astrology at the time, as well as an influx now of the mathematical writings coming from the Hellenistic world. Would it be fair to say then that the reason we consider it the Islamic Golden Age is simply the one language or one script that the Quran was written in then got spread across the entire area so that people are now writing books in the same linguistic script? And that's really just the collection of everything under one banner rather than being a distinctive age of research? What an interesting question that was. Unfortunately, to hear the answer to that question, you are going to have to wait until next week. The original interview with Dr. Daffern lasted a full 90 minutes, and rather than cut down any of the interesting things that he had to say, I've made the choice to split this over 2 weeks, 2 episodes. So if you'd like to hear the second half of this interview and indeed the answer to that question, do remember to tune in next week to the Mathematicians Podcast. In the meantime, if you want to hear more about what I'm getting up to in my own time, you can follow me on Blue Sky at mathematicians-pod. See you again next week. Bye-bye. The music today is Dance Macabre Finale by Kevin MacLeod. You can find more information in the show notes.